Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, whenever you are. Welcome to this event on the economic reverberation of the Ukrainian war on the MENA region. This event, organized in partnership with the Policy Center for the New South and Middle East Institute, is a part of the year-long initiative which will lead us to the 9th edition of the WOERTZ, the annual conference on the Mediterranean region, co-promoted by ISPI and the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation. In this panel, we will have three eminent panelists: Mr. ALDO LIGA, Research Fellow of the MENA Center at the ISPI, Ms. Karen Young, Senior Research Scholar from Columbia University Center on Global Energy Policy and member of the Advisory Council at the Middle East Institute, and Mr. ECKART, WOERTZ, Director of the GIGA Institute of the Middle East Studies of the GIGA Institute. And before we delve into the substance of today's discussion, I would like to take a moment to outline the format of our events. We will have 3 rounds of questions, and each of our esteemed panelists will have the opportunity to share their thoughts for a maximum of 5 minutes. And in the third and the final round, each speaker will have 2 minutes to provide their insights. So thank you. And I will start with our first panelist, Mr. ALDO LIGA. So Mr. ALDO, what are the main economic repercussions of the Russian-Ukrainian war in North African countries, given the divergence of the economic structures among the region?
Thank you, Abdelaziz. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has deeply impacted North African countries, namely by impacting their post-COVID-19 recovery trajectory and exacerbating the pre-existing socioeconomic vulnerabilities. Overall, we expected for 2023 a 3.6% growth rate in the world region, so including the Middle East, that is down from the 5% growth we experienced last year. So broadly speaking, we can say that the current international conjuncture after the beginning of the war in Ukraine has represented an additional layer of complexity to the many domestic economic issues that characterize the North African economy. There are 3 main repercussions of the war. First of all, and most important, the higher commodity prices we are seeing in the region, namely oil and food, the decline of tourist flows from Russia and Ukraine to the countries of the region, and the disruptions in trade with the 2 countries, and overall the broad impact that the global slowdown of economy is having on the economy of the 5 economies of the region. But I think that the real emergency is the higher inflation and increasing cost of living we are seeing in the region. Both are consequences of rising commodity prices on global markets. Why? Because higher consumer prices have a strong social cost and consequently a strong impact on daily life of people of the region. And then there is also an impact on the public finances of these states. More expensive commodity imports imply that measure in place to limit inflation, food and energy subsidies, for example, or price control mechanism, cost much more to the states and result in growing public debt. And in growing public expenditures. And if we consider that subsidies are part of the social contract of the states of the region, we see how any threat to their financial sustainability could rapidly transform into an existential threat to the governments in place. But these are general considerations. We should not forget that this war is affecting the region in a different way, depending on the countries. For example, we have countries that in a certain way are benefited from the current conflict. I'm thinking of Algeria, for example. And the Algerian economy is based on the hydrocarbon revenues, and the higher prices have allowed to the country to increase its export hydrocarbon export revenues by 40% in just 1 year, and the redistribution of this rent has allowed the country to postpone certain very unpopular measures, and to the contrary has allowed the country to reinforce social insurance programs, to cancel already planned tax increases and subsidy cuts, and to refill the reserve funds. To the contrary, there are countries that are in a very different situation, and this is quite worrying. I'm thinking about Egypt and Tunisia. Egypt is in a very dire situation. The national currency has lost almost half of its value in the last year. Inflation has peaked at 20% more compared to last year, so extremely high. Tunisia is facing a very serious financial crisis, with a widening of trade deficits, a significant increase of the budget deficit. The country is facing shortages of staple food in a context of unemployment and a rising number of people who decided to leave the country. And I think that the political situation is not facilitate the macroeconomic reform needed by the country. So just to conclude my intervention, I think that it's important to point out that for months, since the beginning of the months of the war, there have been fears that high inflation, in particular of food items, could result in rallies, in political demonstrations, and in popular expressions of discontent. So far, after 1 year, we can say that the unrest didn't materialize, and that in some way the countries have showed a certain level of resilience. But my point is that the real challenge we will face this year is to measure and to see if this resilience will keep up with the protraction of the war and the risk of further escalation, and the fact that the world economy will certainly remain very sensitive to developments in Ukraine. So I think that in this very volatile context, we hope that the countries of the region will remain resilient, but the risk of destabilization may be just around the corner. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. ALDO LIGA, on this insightful points. Actually, different economic structures have led to different effects on the region. Have pointed out to the disruptions that the energy markets have witnessed, and this is makes me ask our second panelist actually on the impact of the war on the energy markets and the consequences for, at the same time, the oil importing countries and the oil exporting countries. What risk actually this war can pose to the energy transition or the economic diversification in the Gulf countries?
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and I agreed a lot with what Aldo had to say. We're certainly seeing this sort of disaggregation effects across the region, and quite severe. And we know that the Russian war on Ukraine has upended global energy markets, and there are some sort of positive effects, I suppose you could argue. It has spurred investment into renewable energy, accelerated some national infrastructure planning, which we did not have in a very serious way in the United States and now do, also in Europe. The sort of new industrial policies that are emerging as a result of this crisis of energy insecurity. But it's a deep disruption to the way that oil, especially the way that oil markets function. And I think that will be with us for some time because it creates a lack of transparency of where flows are going, and that's a direct result of the embargo of Russian oil and the price cap on Russian oil. And so it's harder for, markets also to anticipate what happens next. There are a lot of other factors, including what happens in China, which creates a great big question mark. But the Russian invasion and the political reactions to that have been even more influential. So that, as Aldo described, has created, higher energy prices in oil and gas, this tremendous inflationary pressure, which is then mediated by higher interest rates, raising borrowing costs, and slowing down economic growth. And that slowdown has meant increasing pressure on currencies to devalue, on central banks to be able to meet their spending and payment obligations. And kind of forward-looking, this means a prolonged period of a sort of low growth or no growth environment. And that's devastating for developing economies, particularly across the region, and creates these kind of dual pressures for structural reforms on the one side, but on meeting demands on citizens and their cost of living on the other. For the oil and gas exporters in the Gulf, this has been a year of tremendous revenue. And there's no doubt about that. But I think on the political side, it's also an interesting moment of leadership in the way that we think about energy transition and transition globally, and how politically we accept the consequences of that market leadership or management or manipulation, however you want to parse it, from OPEC plus members, but led specifically by Saudi Arabia and the UAE and the Gulf. Saudi Arabia earned about $326 billion in oil revenues in 2022. And even as that revenue has declined on a month-to-month basis by the end of last year, it is substantial. And, this creates certainly a sense of validation in the management of oil markets, but it also creates a new politics of disbursement within the MENA region. So as we have seen, really the reliance on the Gulf states as agents of development, as providers of economic assistance and investment. And this is becoming, I think, a real determining factor in the trajectory of other economies within the region. I have a new book about the economic statecraft of the Gulf states in the MENA and wider region. And this trend has been, 10 years or more in the making, but now it has reached, I think, certainly a high point. This is a moment of engagement from the Gulf on ideas of what, quote unquote, an orderly transition looks like. And so we're seeing a real kind of politicization and a forming of arguments and policies around how that should happen. So it doesn't just mean investment in oil and gas, which the Gulf states have been advocating for, but it also has meant tremendous investment in renewable energy and new technologies, particularly for cleaner hydrocarbon production and carbon capture. And so the Gulf states are really leading that dialogue and leading that investment in the kind of firms and technologies which we will all rely on in the next 20 years. The truth is, though, that we will have continued oil demand. We can debate about how it will decline in different scenarios over the next 20, 25 years to 2050. It might be 20 million barrels a day. It might be 80 million barrels a day. But a lot of it will come from OPEC and specifically from the Gulf. We can talk maybe later, perhaps more in LNG markets, but the kind of takeaway is that the Middle East is really central as a supplier of current LNG and what we expect kind of going forward out to 2030, certainly with Qatar and the United States as major producers, probably making up about half of global LNG supplies together. Russia is not completely out of this market, and there's I think broad consensus that they will suffer from lack of investment and lack of access to technology, but we have to kind of keep that in the back of our minds of the role that Russia will play in continued LNG exports into the future. So your question was more about economic diversification within the Gulf. I don't think that this crisis has really deterred or diminished that drive. It's just become more integrated into understanding the central role that particularly OPEC and Gulf producers will play in the future of oil demand, along with, creating a sort of niche for how that oil is produced in a cleaner way, and the technologies around it that Gulf states will certainly dominate, and technologies within new renewable capacity as well. I think for U.S. relationships, we can talk more about how that becomes complicated within the MENA region, and also in terms of EU relationships with the Gulf and within the kind of Eastern Med and what happens in gas. But all in all, I would say that the war on Ukraine, the Russian aggression in Ukraine, has created this sense of lack of transparency on where and how oil gets to market. It has created opportunities for arbitrage in the delivery of Russian supply at lower prices to those countries which are growing and most dependent on it. And this is, a further kind of deepening or disaggregation or deglobalization. There are lots of words to describe these tensions that are developing between the parts of the world which are, what we think of the West, and the parts of the world which are growing and really reliant on hydrocarbon for their energy needs. And the Gulf states sit right at the middle of that confluence.
Yes, thanks. So maybe those things we're gonna deep into in the second round of the questions. But one of the dimensions that has been really affected by the war is the food security dimension, as the region has been really exposed to the Russian and the Ukrainian war, and they are highly dependent on imports of some specific products coming from this region. And this would lead me to my third panelist, Mr. ECKART, WOERTZ, on the impact of the war on the food security in the region, which are countries that have been mostly affected by this crisis.
Yeah, thanks for having me. The former Soviet Union states have become major suppliers to global grain markets over the past 2 decades or so. So they kind of have resumed their role that they had in the late 19th century and early 20th century, which they didn't have at the time of the Soviet Union, which was a major grain importer, especially when it appeared on markets in the 1970s as a major importer for its livestock program. It actually was a contributing factor to food price inflation at that time. So that role has really changed, and the MENA region is a major customer and as such quite dependent on the Black Sea region, especially in some countries such as Egypt, Sudan and Lebanon. There's been a very pronounced dependence on deliveries from the Black Sea region. The grain, the wheat from there is of lesser quality, so the protein content, for example, is not as high, but it has been cheaper, and especially in Egypt, we have seen really a shift from higher suppliers or more costly suppliers, for example, in North America, to former Soviet Union states. Having said that, I would caution to attribute too much importance to the Ukraine crisis, because international wheat prices, yes, they spiked. Yes, it caused a shock, of course, in the import-dependent MENA countries. But right now, the wheat prices are at pre-war levels. The natural gas prices are below pre-war levels, and the oil price is only slightly above pre-war levels. So, I mean, inflation is obviously there, not just in the MENA, but globally. But to kind of attribute too much importance to the Ukraine war, I think would be a mistake, and is not backed up by the price developments on international markets. And in a way, markets, there has been a lot of disruptions, no doubt about it. But in a way, markets have worked, as Karen has pointed out, right? There's a bit of a merry-go-round in the oil market. Yes, of course, the Russians are delivering less oil to Europe, but more to Asia, where they actually compete with deliveries from the MENA, while Europe receives its oil from somewhere else, for example, from the MENA. So, yes, Russia has to accept a lot of discounts. India and China certainly do not mind. But I really wouldn't overestimate the price impact that we're seeing, or the price impact of the war on the inflation that we are seeing. and it's not just about supplies, right? Like if we take a look at food security in the MENA region, there's a tendency to focus a lot on this import dependency, what they could do in terms of increasing domestic production and so on, which is basically impossible for lack of water. So they will remain food import dependent, and there are no technological silver bullets, whatever vertical farming or other things they try. So there is this dependency, and it can be managed, as we see. Yes, there are disruptions, but also new allocations via the market. So I think the main challenges for food security in the MENA is less that import dependence, although it's intuitively understandable why they are worried about it, but more questions of food accessibility, social inequalities. During the COVID crisis, we even had food security challenges in some labor camps in the Gulf, right? When they went into lockdown and there was only insufficient service provision in those labor camps. I think things like that need to be taken into consideration. And actually, when we take a look at food security, there's a lot of obesity in the MENA region, even in poorer countries like in Egypt. So I think we should define food security less as a lack of calories, which there is none in the MENA region, as we can see with the obesity rates that are quite high by international standards. But rather a lack of micronutrients and balanced diet. So I think this discussion would need to be broader and not just focus on the provision of calories, many of which are of course imported. Thanks.
So thanks for this broad assessment of the food security and to what extent the Ukrainian war has contributed to this inflation that you see that seems much more structural than just cyclical. And here I move to our first panelist in the second round to talk about this influence that Russia can have in the region, or actually the relation between European countries and the MENA region following this context.
Yes. Thank you, Abdelaziz. Yes, I think that 1 year after the war, we can say that the relations between the European Union and the MENA countries has improved a lot, and it has improved mainly as a reaction to the global energy crisis. The need to diversify energy suppliers has indeed pushed European countries to look with more emphasis and attention to the southern Mediterranean countries, and at least partially to change their foreign policy accordingly. For example, if we look at Italy, Italy has reinforced its already strong relations with Algeria. Members of the former government led by Mario Draghi visited the country several times and secured significant agreements for additional supplies of natural gas. And today, Algeria overcome Russia in its exports of gas to Italy, and it is the first supplier of natural gas to Italy. The new government led by Giorgia Meloni is launching a new plan called the Mattei Plan, named after the name of the founder of the energy group ENI. And one of the aims of this plan is to establish a new framework of energy cooperation with North African and Sub-Saharan countries. The president visited Libya some weeks ago, and energy was at the very center of the discussion with the prime minister based in Tripoli. But not only Italy is pushing this energy policy towards the region. For example, German companies have signed agreements for the shipment of liquefied natural gas from Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and very recently with Oman. And the country is in some way trying to balance its energy security with the principle of energy transition. And think that in this road, it's important the partnership that Germany has established with Morocco for potential exports of green hydrogen in the next years or decades. Also, the European Union signed agreements to export gas from the Eastern Mediterranean, from Egypt and Israel. So energy has clearly dominated the economic relations between the two shores, in particularly since the outbreak of the war, but also in terms of trade, we have assisted to a strong increase in terms of commercial exchanges. But at the same time, it seems to me that the economic relations between the two shores are really unbalanced on European priorities and maybe too calibrated on European interests. For example, the commitment of European countries on the many other economic emergencies which have affected the countries of the region is quite limited. Last year, in order to tackle food insecurity in the region, the European Commission allocated only 225 million euros for this emergency, and it is quite limited. Or if we compare the amount, for example, of aid to Egypt from Gulf countries, amount allocated to alleviate the many problems Egypt has, the EU engagement seems like a drop in the ocean. I mean, it is much more limited.
Thanks, Aldo. So on one side, the European and the relation with the MENA have expanded. On the other sides, Mr. Khan will ask you about the relation between the Gulf and the United States.
Sure. Well, I think also what Aldo is describing is this, very much, what a sense of energy insecurity does to foreign policies. And we've certainly seen that from the EU, but we also see it in the case of the US and US bilateral relationships in the Gulf and the wider region. So there has certainly been tension around, and certainly, last October in the Biden administration, very unhappy with the OPEC Plus decision to cut production. And there was a lot of politics around that. And I think it signals that these relationships need to be managed and communicated differently at a more technical level, perhaps, but also with an understanding of who the major players are now and what kind of leverage they have and what kind of leverage they will continue to have into the future. And this is where the Gulf states really emerge, Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Qatar on gas, as tremendous players. And so the way that you see them using that leverage, you see it towards the north, towards the Mediterranean, where the Gulf states are key investors in new gas developments on the coast of Egypt and Israel. And this is, part of their ability to deploy capital and to be where energy demand will be in the future. That also creates tremendous political influence and leverage as well. You don't see the United States and the European Union sitting in the same kind of positions because they don't have the sorts of national economic resources and funds deployed for that purpose to do so. We're not organized in our economies in that way. So I would say the politics of Europe and the Gulf have grown closer, or there are more points of contact, certainly on these questions of energy. But it also creates political openings and perhaps I would say grievances among producers within the MENA region. And so this will kind of further exacerbate that, energy haves and have-nots, but also among energy exporters, just a real difference in terms of ability to invest and ability to capture this momentum in this moment of export revenue, which is not going to be forever, particularly when you're thinking of Europe as your market, right? And particularly for gas. So that increases those kind of inequalities and unequal playing field, you could say, within the MENA region. For U.S. relationships in MENA, this gets even more complicated, first with the kind of oil and gas exporters, because they're competitors. The U.S. is probably will be up to 2030 the most important LNG supplier globally, along with Qatar, right? So this is a competitive relationship as well. The same is true in oil. And it's a difficult balance. We're going to see another platform developing where the United States and the European states see the Gulf states as partners in development. And the Egypt case is very important here. So we've seen the IMF package most recently to Egypt that explicitly includes an expectation of Gulf financial support, whether that's in commitments of foreign direct investment, of the purchase of assets which are sold by the Egyptian state, or in support via central bank deposits and that kind of direct support to currency stabilization. And so, the leaning on the Gulf by international financial institutions and by traditional agents of development, the Europeans and the Americans, is changing again that leverage and that positioning of the Gulf states as partners within the region and more broadly, both on the clean energy transition and on actors or agents of economic development and development policy. So this creates a real challenge in U.S. politics because there's, of course, a lot of polarization around what the bilateral relationship, particularly with Saudi Arabia, should look like. So on the one hand, the U.S. is saying, we're your competitor and we don't like the way you're handling global oil markets, but we also want to be your partner and want to rely on you to create stability and economic investment and lifelines for other states in the region. And that's becoming a very, very difficult balance to reach.
So with this very complex relation between the Gulf and the United States, I will turn to Mr. ECKART to talk about the Russian penetration, the economic penetration in the MENA region, from the energy to trade and tourism. So what are the main interests Moscow has in the economy of the wider Mediterranean region?
What Russia has in the wider Mediterranean region?
Yes, Russian interests. Okay. Russian interest in the wider Mediterranean region, maybe especially in the MENA region.
I mean, Russia's economic weight is rather limited, right? The economy has a size of the economy of the GDP is about the same as the GDP of Spain. So it only has a couple of sectors. In the oil sectors, it's clearly a competitive relationship, especially now with the sanctions against Russia and its basically its need to accept steep discounts in the Asian markets. Otherwise, there are arms and there is nuclear technology. So Russia plays a role in Egypt and in Turkey and in respective nuclear energy programs. But in sheer size, it's not that big. That market, right? It's more like the strategic importance of it. And then there are arms. So some MENA countries like Algeria, for example, are major recipients of arms from Russia. They have also tried to make inroads in the Gulf region. You might remember the spat between Turkey and the US over deliveries of anti-aircraft missiles from Russia to Turkey, which Turkey has received and basically risked a major diplomatic spat with the US. And as a result, it didn't receive the aircraft it wanted from the US. So having said that, with the Ukraine war, I'm not an arms industry expert, but it seems to me that the Russians need to replace a lot of arms in their own military. And at the same time, Russian arms as an export good maybe are not as popular as they used to be before, because considerable shortcomings have been revealed on the Ukrainian battlefield. So these smoldering wrecks of Russian tanks in Ukraine are certainly not the best promotion of the Russian arms export industry. But basically, we are talking about these three sectors, and we might add food as a fourth sector. But beyond that, Russia is not a major provider of industrial exports or technology, and as such, also not as attractive for the MENA region, like Asian countries or the West, for that matter.
So not a systemic player in the region, given the size. So one of the things also that we have witnessed in the region is that this recent shifts, not recent, but this has been compounded by the crisis toward much more nationalist and sovereign policies. This is a global trend, but this is also a trend that we have witnessed at the regional level, and countries right now are turning much more inward and focusing on setting very aggressive industrial policy. And Mr. ECKART have pointed out this sensitivity towards imports when it comes to food. And I think this trend is seen as a response, of course, to the current crisis, but also to some very structural things related to the COVID, related to the global environment. So while I think that in the Northern Mediterranean countries, and I mean here Europe, we have seen some increased collaboration and integration given the threat of the war. And the crisis have actually closed the gap between these countries. But at the other side of the Mediterranean, especially here in North Africa, this current poly-crisis environment is posing serious challenges for the economic bloc that we're aspiring for. At the same time, with this trend could be just temporary. So this deglobalization or globalization can also be a temporary trend. And the history have shown that countries tend to increase in the long term their interdependence over the time. So here I will pick the minds of our brilliant panelists to ask them, and I will start with Mr. ALDO on this trend towards disintegration in the MENA region versus integration on the other side of the Mediterranean.
Yes. So I think that, of course, for example, in North Africa, we cannot see increasing economic integration due to the many, for example, political contentions that exist between Algeria and Morocco, for the instability in Libya. Certainly, the Maghreb region is not an integrated region. It is exactly the contrary. But I think that if we have a look at a regional scale, including, so a Mediterranean scale, including both the shore of the sea, then we see that actually there is a tendency to more integration and to more collaboration. For example, there are several European car manufacturers that now invest in Morocco for the production of vehicles, then are exported to Europe. But also, for example, Morocco is has applied to join the ECOWAS, the Economic Community of Western African States. And in my opinion, this is a good sign of the will of the country to integrate with other regional subsystems. And or, for example, if we move westward, Algeria and Italy, yes, are collaborating on energy, but also they are connecting their small and medium-sized enterprises and startups to attract new investments, and or the European Union is investing a lot on sustainable infrastructure between the two shores. So yes, there are examples of fragmentation after the COVID-19 pandemic and after the war, but there are also examples of integration. There are a will of self-sufficiency in some fields. For example, I remember last year when the war began, a lot of thoughts and discourse on the agricultural self-sufficiency in the region, and so in some sectors yes, but in other no. In other, I think that the most adopted strategy is to diversify partnership rather than than to look to economic policy from an individual or nationalist point of view.
Thanks, Mr. ALDO. So I will share the same question with Karin in ECKART on the future of the integration or disintegration on the region, and maybe the extent to which the relation will be balanced in the future. Mr. ALDO just pointed out that most of the economic relations are witnessing right now, and this demand for the MENA region is coming from Europe just as a short-term reaction to what's going on at the world level, especially in the energy market.
Thank you. I agree with a lot of what Aldo said, and I think those examples are really important ones because they speak to the kind of policy innovation of individual countries, right? So Morocco being, very innovative in its ability to attract investment to get into new industry, whether it's on the EVs or in other kinds of renewable technology. But that's not a factor of regional integration. That's smart policy by one country, right? And using incentive packages available through perhaps the EU. So I think the big trends, the mega trends that we look forward, and you ask, is this globalization something that will be with us in a temporary way or in a long-term way? No one knows, right? But certainly those pressures are very, very omnipresent, and it is changing the sentiment of how people in the investment world look ahead. And it's a pretty negative sentiment. And so, the geopolitics really playing out and weighing on prospects for economic integration, prospects for growth, and kind of severing of many of those kind of traditional global trade ties that we saw growing through the 80s and 90s. That doesn't mean that, global trade is over, certainly not. It just means that we're going to see certainly more focus on national industrial policy, on energy policy, and these more, bilateral engagements and, investments of state priorities. So that means the Gulf investing in LNG in the Eastern Mediterranean. It means that there will be certain companies that are, supported by state vehicles who will be champions in renewable power and will be deployed in, some places and not in others, right? So it's not going to be equal in access to new technology, access to new investment and development opportunity. And so that's why the politics matter more and more. And I have to pull out, there is this kind of growing geopolitical tension of the democracies versus non-democracies, and this of course puts a lot of pressure within the MENA region to choose sides or to describe themselves in new ways, and that I think is ultimately very difficult certainly for U.S. foreign policy, and in the kind of continued relationships that we might want to have, especially on energy transition priorities that are shared, right? So those become much more difficult. What is integrating, of course, is more of a pull of oil and gas producers to their consumers in Asia. And so interesting kind of integration with India into the Gulf, I think, is fascinating. And certainly the relationship with China becomes more and more important.
Mr. ECKART, on the industrial policy, they mentioned to what extent country might be looking inward in order to increase their self-sufficiency. And this is actually the case of for example, the agriculture sector. And I'm talking here for the example here in Morocco, and the different sensitiveness regarding this reliance on imports that had been seen as a sign of weakness, let's say.
Well, I think there's a potential for more economic integration between the European Union and some MENA states, most notably North Africa, in the wake of the COVID crisis and disruption of supply chains. Some companies are thinking about nearshoring to kind of shorten their supply chains geographically. So some countries in Eastern Europe can benefit from that, but certainly also in North Africa, thinking about Morocco or Tunisia, for example. Also, I think what is very important is if we had some sort of energy transition, and the goals are very ambitious, right? If we take a look at the green hydrogen plans of the European Union, of the German government, for example, with its H2 Diplo initiative, then we will have a whole new importance of infrastructure across the Mediterranean, be it the existing or planned natural gas pipelines that also could be repurposed to hydrogen pipelines in the future, to interconnectors that already exist, for example, between the Iberian Peninsula and North Africa. Further interconnectors are being planned. There's a huge project, X-Links, to provide electricity produced from renewable energy in the south of Morocco to the UK. There's an interconnector planned linking the European continent to Cyprus and Israel, and so on. And interconnection of grids, of course, is an important aspect of addressing intermittency of renewables and ease their integration into existing energy mixes, besides storage solutions, for example. So I think, and another project you might have noticed is the H2 Med pipeline that is now being built from Barcelona to Marseille. Again, a project that might be first used for natural gas transport, later on for hydrogen. So this whole idea of energy transition and the importance of green hydrogen, the possible importance of natural gas as a bridge fuel, that also has been acknowledged within the EU taxonomy, what is being considered a green energy or not. There was quite some controversial debate about that regarding natural gas and nuclear energy. So the infrastructure, the emerging infrastructure of the energy transition is rather conducive to an increase in interlinkages between some MENA countries, or actually the whole MENA region and Europe.
So thanks for this very insightful comments and remarks. Now, as we're heading to the end of our panel, our audience is sharing their questions, and I will stick just to one question per panelist, and I will ask you really to be brief. Mr. Aldo, so one of our audience is asking if the economic deterioration in North Africa is to affect migration flows to Italy. This is a classic question, yeah.
Okay. Yes. To understand if economic deterioration in North African countries is influencing migration flows, we should ask maybe to the people who arrive in Italy, but it's quite, or in Spain, but it's quite difficult and costly to do it, and basically nobody does it. But for example, if we look at the flows from Tunisia, we see that they begin to increase and to augment some years ago in 2017, when the economic situation started to going bad. And for example, last year we had a peak of arrivals of people from Egypt, and maybe this is actually there is a correlation with the economic situation of the country. So maybe yes, there is a correlation between rising numbers of people moving to Italy and Southern Europe, and the economic situation, the actual economic situation. After all, unemployment and lack of opportunities are generally among the reasons why people decide to leave their country of origin.
Thanks. So, Ms. Karen and Mr. ECKART, one of the questions that the audience is sharing is, and actually you have answer to this point, is on the climate action in the MENA region, given this war, and to what extent countries are fully engaged in their energy transition.
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question. Is the question, are they fully engaged in the energy transition?
Yes, and to what extent this war, the question is that to what extent this war can really affect their commitment?
Well, it certainly spurred investment interest, and it's also given the oil and gas producers in the region more of a voice in how they see that transition happening and their own role in it. We saw that in COP in Egypt, and the kind of changing dialogue and taxonomy on the role of gas. And we'll see it in the COP to come this fall in the UAE, where certainly oil and gas producers will be more present and dominant in this discussion of how, quote unquote, orderly the transition can be, and their role in providing, energy security through traditional hydrocarbons that are cleaner well into the future. And so, the discourse is changing, I think is really important to note, and important to note that it's coming from within the region and producers within the region. I think we are yet to see some of the promise. I'm quite skeptical actually on the justification for pipeline gas, because in the future it might be a vehicle for hydrogen export to Europe. I think, getting down into the weeds of cost and real kind of viability of projects like that will be important, because I think we have a little bit of over optimism of the kind of cost feasibility of what that infrastructure looks like.
Mr. ECKART, any views to add on this?
Well, I mean, there are very ambitious plans. The UAE wants to be net zero by 2050, Saudi Arabia by 2060. Let's see, the ambitions are there. Will they materialize? We will need to see. I mean, the energy consumption per capita is very high in the region. So for that to come to such a large extent from renewable energies, it's still an open question. You need to see there's no free lunch in this world. Renewable energies have very considerable material needs, and mining those materials, lithium, cobalt, and so on, comes with very considerable environmental impact, and also socio-political conflict, potentially with in affected communities. So I think, yes, it's important. I think there is considerable reason for optimism, but there are considerable challenges as well. So there is a certain geopolitics of renewable energy transitions emerging that's not yet fully appreciated by some of the people or politicians involved in such debates.
So thank you so much. Thank you so much, Aldo, Karin, and ECKART, for these insightful comments. The event is over. So I would like also to thank our audience for their interaction, the ISPI for giving us the space to talk about such a passionate topic. So thank you.
Thank you.